She stood barely 5 feet tall, with hands too delicate for a life spent in cotton fields. Yet every judge, every plantation owner, and every man who crossed her path learned one truth. Sarah Granger feared nothing. In Oklahoma Territory, her name traveled faster than court summonses and whispered rumors. For trials, for masters, for injuries so precise that even seasoned doctors questioned how she'd learned to cut like a surgeon. But what terrified people wasn't the violence. It was the calm behind it. Sarah never screamed, never wept, never begged. She walked into courtrooms with the posture of someone who had already accepted the price of her choices. Men who believed they owned her body discovered that ownership ended the moment they tried to violate it. And juries, 12 white men at a time, found themselves unable to convict a woman who defended herself with such cold clarity. What made her dangerous wasn't the blade in her hand. It was the knowledge she shared, the letters she collected, the underground network she quietly built. Before her death in a federal prison, Sarah Granger left behind something far more powerful than resistance. A blueprint. Court records from Oklahoma Territory tell of a woman whose very name made plantation owners fall silent. Sarah Granger, a name whispered with equal parts terror and fascination across 3 counties, stood trial not once, but 4 separate times between 1847 and 1856. Each trial involved the same peculiar charge: grievous assault upon the person of her lawful master. Each time, the courtroom emptied of women and children before testimony began. And each time, despite overwhelming evidence, no jury would convict her. The wounds she inflicted were too specific, too calculated, too permanent. 3 men lost their ability to father children. A 4th lost something else entirely. His mind, they said, though the official record listed only severe trauma requiring medical intervention. The authorities knew what she'd done. The community knew. But something about Sarah Granger's case made even hardened frontier judges look away. What could drive a legal system built on absolute control to repeatedly release its most dangerous captive? Before we continue with the story of Sarah Granger, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, stories they tried to bury in forgotten court archives, do not surface often. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're watching from. I want to know where these stories are reaching. Now let's discover what made Sarah Granger so dangerous that even her owners feared putting her name in writing. The question of what made Sarah Granger dangerous wasn't one that could be answered by appearance alone, though those who saw her never forgot her. She stood just over 5 feet tall. Her hands seemed too delicate for the cotton fields where she'd spent most of her 32 years. Her face bore a single distinctive mark, a thin scar running from her left temple to her jawline, courtesy of an overseer's whip when she was 14. But it was her eyes that unsettled people. They didn't carry the downcast submission expected of someone in her position. They measured. They calculated. They remembered everything. Sarah had been born in 1824 on a tobacco plantation in northern Alabama, the daughter of a woman whose name was never recorded in any ledger. Her first master, Edmund Hartwell, had been what the community considered reasonable. He fed his workers adequately, punished only when drunk, occasionally allowed marriages among his property. Sarah learned to read by watching Hartwell's daughter practice her letters, memorizing the shapes through a crack in the schoolroom wall. This education, illegal and dangerous, would later prove essential to her survival. When Hartwell died in 1842, his estate was liquidated to pay gambling debts. Sarah was 18, strong, and literate, qualities that made her valuable. She was sold to a cotton trader named James Wickham for $850, a price that reflected both her physical capability and what Wickham called her refined bearing. The sale separated her from her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and the only home she'd ever known. The journey west to Oklahoma Territory took 6 weeks. Chained in a wagon with 11 others, she watched the landscape change from green hills to endless prairie. Oklahoma Territory in 1842 was a contradictory place, officially Indian Territory, yet increasingly populated by white settlers who brought their peculiar institutions with them. The land itself seemed caught between identities. Creek and Cherokee nations coexisted uneasily with Presbyterian missionaries, federal troops, and plantation owners fleeing depleted soil in older states. Towns like Tahlequah and Fort Gibson serve as administrative centers where territorial law, tribal sovereignty, and federal jurisdiction collided in unpredictable ways. Wickham's holdings lay 15 miles south of Fort Gibson in what is now Muscogee County. 300 acres of cotton, corn, and tobacco, worked by 42 men, women, and children. They lived in a row of 7 cabins behind the main house. The overseer, a thick-necked Georgian named Walter Pute, ran the fields with methodical brutality. 20 lashes for talking during work, 30 for leaving the fields without permission, 50 for striking back. The punishment was administered publicly every Saturday after sundown. The assembled workers were forced to watch as Pute demonstrated the consequences of disobedience. Sarah spent her first 3 months keeping her head down and her literacy hidden. She picked cotton with mechanical efficiency, never the fastest but never the slowest. She learned which workers could be trusted and which would trade information for extra rations. She learned that Wickham visited the cabins on Tuesday nights, when his wife traveled to Fort Gibson to visit her sister. She learned that Pute preferred the younger women, the ones who hadn't yet developed the hollow-eyed resignation that came with years of such attention. She also learned that Wickham's wife, Charlotte, knew everything that happened on the plantation, but had long since stopped caring. Charlotte Wickham had once been a Charleston belle, daughter of a shipping magnate, educated in French and piano. Now she was 34, childless, sustained by laudanum and the pretense that her husband's nocturnal wanderings were merely inspections of the property. She spent her days in the parlor, playing the same Chopin nocturne over and over, until the notes seemed to bleed into the walls. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday in late November 1842, 5 months after Sarah's arrival. Wickham appeared at her cabin door just after 10 o'clock, when most of the exhausted workers had collapsed into sleep. He carried no lamp. He knew the path too well. Sarah was awake, had been awake, because Tuesday nights had a particular kind of silence. The other women in the cabin did not move when Wickham entered, did not acknowledge his presence. This was the unspoken rule. You pretended not to see, not to hear, not to know. Wickham stood over Sarah's pallet for a long moment. She could smell whiskey on him, mixed with tobacco and the pomade in his hair. When he reached down and touched her shoulder, she did not flinch. She simply said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "They'll kill you if you touch me again." He laughed, soft, almost fond, as if Shed told a clever joke. His hand moved from her shoulder to her throat, not squeezing, just resting there, a reminder of the absolute nature of his ownership. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds, though witnesses later struggled to describe the sequence. Sarah's hand, hidden beneath her thin blanket, emerged holding something metallic. There was a brief, violent motion. Wickham made a sound, not quite a scream, more like all the air leaving his lungs at once. He staggered backward, colliding with the cabin wall. Blood soaked through his trousers with shocking speed. Sarah stood, walked past him, out into the November night, still holding the cotton knife Shed stolen from the gin house 2 weeks earlier. She walked directly to the main house, climbed the steps, knocked on the door with calm precision, like someone delivering an expected message. Charlotte Wickham answered, still dressed, despite the late hour. Her eyes glazed with opium and something like curiosity. Sarah held out the bloodied knife, handle first, and said, "Your husband tried to force himself on me. Eve injured him. He's in cabin 4. I'll need a doctor." Then she sat on the porch steps and waited. Dr. Theodore Gaines was roused from sleep at midnight. He rode 14 miles through darkness to attend to an injury whose nature he refused to describe in detail. Gaines arrived to find Wickham barely conscious. Charlotte sat in the parlor downstairs, still playing that same nocturne, the same haunting melody repeating over and over, the only acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred in the house. Sarah Granger sat on the porch with her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if attending a quiet church service. The medical details entered into the official record only as severe trauma to the gentleman's person, rendering future marital relations inadvisable. In less delicate terms, shared in whispers between doctors and lawyers, Sarah had castrated James Wickham with a 3-inch cotton knife. The cut so clean, so precise, that Gaines initially believed she must have had surgical training. Wickham survived physically. He spent 6 weeks recovering in his bedroom, while Charlotte continued her mechanical piano practice downstairs, those same 16 measures repeating like a clock wound too tight. During Wickham's convalescence, overseer Walter Pute ran the plantation. His punishments grew more severe, his temper shorter, but even he did not touch Sarah. Nobody touched Sarah. The legal question of what to do with her soon became Oklahoma Territory's most uncomfortable conversation. Territorial law was clear. A slave who struck a master could be executed. A slave who caused permanent injury should be executed. But the circumstances complicating this case, Wickham's nocturnal visit, the nature of the injury, the fact that Sarah immediately surrendered herself, created a situation no official wanted to address publicly. Judge Samuel Breenage, a Kentucky transplant who had spent 20 years navigating the contradictions of frontier justice, was assigned the case. He had presided over land disputes between Cherokee Nation and white settlers. He had ruled in murder trials where tribal and federal law offered opposite verdicts. But Sarah Granger's case presented something different, a moral question disguised as a legal one. Breenage interviewed Sarah privately in the courthouse at Fort Gibson. The conversation was never officially transcribed, but later recounted to his clerk. Sarah answered every question with disturbing calm. Yes, she had taken a knife 2 weeks prior, anticipating Wickham's eventual visit. Yes, she understood anatomy well enough to ensure the injury would be permanent. No, she felt no remorse. When Breenage asked why she had chosen that punishment, her answer chilled him. I wanted to make sure he couldn't do to anyone else what he tried to do to me. The trial lasted 1 day. Wickham could not attend, though the official excuse was lingering medical issues. In truth, he could not face a courtroom where his injury would be read aloud into the record. Pute testified that Sarah had always been difficult, prone to insolence. Dr. Gaines described the injury with clinical discomfort. Charlotte Wickham did not testify at all. She sat in the gallery, silent, unreadable. The defense came from a surprising source. A Creek tribal delegate, William Harjo, stood and argued that under tribal law, still technically applicable in Indian Territory, Sarah's actions constituted self-defense against sexual assault. His presence was irregular, possibly illegal, definitely unprecedented, but Judge Breenage allowed him to speak. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Their verdict, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Prosecutors demanded a retrial. Plantation owners across 3 counties sent letters of outrage. A Baptist minister published a sermon warning that acquitting Sarah would encourage rebellion among the servile population. But Breenage stood by the verdict. Sarah returned to the plantation only briefly. She was sold immediately. Her new owner was Marcus Sheffield, a widower who operated a smaller farm 30 miles west. The sale price was $600, $150 less than Wickham had paid, reflecting, Sheffield wrote, her diminished value due to criminal tendencies. Sheffield had a reputation as a reasonable master. Presbyterian, widowed, occasionally allowed his workers to earn small wages for extra tasks. Sarah lasted 4 months. Then she cut him too. The pattern was identical. A late-night visit, an attempted assault, a precise, anatomically deliberate injury. This time she used a straight razor stolen from Sheffield's shaving kit, hidden beneath his bed, discovered during her cleaning rotation. Sheffield survived with somewhat better health than Wickham, though he, too, lost the ability to father the children he had been discussing with potential second wives. Dr. Gaines was summoned for the second time. To treat an injury he found increasingly disturbing. In his private journal, he wrote, "She possesses knowledge of human anatomy that would be impressive in a medical student. How she acquired this knowledge, I cannot fathom." The second trial drew an even larger crowd. People traveled from as far as Tahlequah. It had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a public referendum on unspoken questions. How much violence is justified in self-defense? Can property defend itself against its owner? What happens when the law's absolutes encounter situations that defy absolutes? This time, Sarah testified. Over furious objections from the prosecutor, Judge Greenidge allowed her to speak. For 2 full hours, she described her life with unnerving clarity. Her sail away from her mother. Wickham's weekly visits. The women who pretended to sleep so completely they looked dead. And her misguided belief that once a man knew what she was capable of, he would choose differently. "I was wrong about that," she said. Tate, the prosecutor, demanded she express remorse. Her answer became famous. "I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret defending myself." The jury deliberated 11 hours. Not guilty. Again, Sheffield sold her immediately, this time for $420. Her price dropped each time she defended herself. Everyone understood why. Her next owner, Elias Drummond, believed himself immune to the risks. He ran a cotton gin and small mill near the Canadian River. He considered himself a progressive master. He lasted 9 months. Then Sarah cut him. The pattern never changed. A night visit, an attempted assault, a precise injury delivered with surgical accuracy. This time she used a paring knife from the kitchen, the edge honed to perfection on the millstone. Dr. Gaines, summoned for the 3rd time, began taking detailed notes. The consistency of her technique, its precision, its deliberateness, was becoming impossible to ignore. The 3rd trial drew national attention. Abolitionist newspapers praised Sarah's resistance. Pro-slavery papers demanded her execution. A group of plantation owners petitioned the territorial governor for intervention, calling Sarah's continued freedom a danger to the stability of society. But the pattern held. Evidence overwhelming. Testimony graphic. Public pressure immense. The jury still acquitted her. They confessed later they believed she was guilty under the law, but could not convict her. Drummond didn't sell her. He freed her. He filed manumission papers in December 1851, citing irreconcilable differences in temperament. He paid her $75 in wages and arranged her transportation to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where a free black community lived along the river. For 3 years, Sarah lived quietly. She worked as a seamstress, rented a small room, learned to read and write with fluency, attended evening classes taught by a Quaker schoolteacher who asked no questions about her past. She might have stayed there, might have disappeared into a quiet life. But in May 1854, she returned. She walked back across the border into Indian Territory, traveled 43 miles to Fort Gibson, and presented herself at the courthouse. She wanted to testify in another woman's trial, a woman accused of assaulting her master under circumstances eerily similar to her own. This is where the story sharpens and darkens. Her return would change everything. The woman Sarah wanted to defend was named Hannah. No surname recorded. 19 years old. Accused of striking her master with a fire poker after he forced entry into her cabin. Hannah's master survived, with a broken collarbone and severe bruising. Unlike Sarah's cases, where the patterns were undeniable, Hannah's defense was less certain. Her master claimed he had been checking on reports of illness. Claimed Hannah attacked without provocation. Sarah's appearance in the courtroom caused immediate controversy. Judge Greenidge, now 63, weary, and increasingly aware of the contradictions he presided over, initially refused to allow her testimony. She wasn't a witness. She hadn't been present. She had no legal standing. But Sarah had anticipated these objections. She brought documents, years of correspondence with other women across 3 territories, letters describing the same patterns of assault, the same patterns of retaliation, the same legal outcomes. She had been collecting them since her arrival in Fort Smith, using her literacy, her wages, and her quiet persistence to build a network no one knew existed. Some letters came from free women. Many came from enslaved women, smuggled out through networks Sarah had cultivated. Judge Greenidge reviewed the letters in his chambers. What he read disturbed him so deeply that he made an unprecedented decision. He would allow Sarah to testify, not as a witness to the crime, but as an expert on self-defense against sexual assault. The prosecution exploded in protest. Territorial officials threatened complaints to the federal judiciary. But Greenidge, tired, ill, and nearing the end of his life, did not care. He had spent 2 decades watching law bend itself into impossible shapes to avoid moral truths. He would not bend this time. Sarah testified for 3 days. She described patterns she had documented across the territory. The time of night assaults typically occurred. The excuses masters used for entering cabins. The way enslaved communities developed warning systems. The strategies women used to protect each other. The anatomy of self-defense. Why certain injuries mattered. Why precision meant survival when strength was unequal. The prosecutor, Harrison Tate, tried again and again to trap her. He asked if she had planned her own acts, if she had encouraged violence, if she had instructed women to harm their masters. But each time, Sarah answered with the same calm clarity. I prepared women for the possibility of needing to defend themselves. That is not the same as planning an attack. Her testimony transformed the courtroom. Jurors who had entered believing the case was simple now struggled to breathe under the weight of what they had heard. Women in the gallery wept silently. Even some men, hard men, frontier men, lowered their eyes. Hannah was acquitted. 19 hours of deliberation. Multiple deadlocks. A final reluctant agreement. After the verdict, the foreman told a newspaper, "We realized she might not be innocent." But Hannah wasn't the threat. The system that put her in that cabin was. Sarah's return to Oklahoma Territory did something no one expected. Other women, enslaved women, began seeking her out. They came at night, quietly, often walking miles in the dark. They asked questions. How do I protect myself? What are my rights in court? How do I defend my children? What happens if I fight back? What punishment will come? Sarah answered everything with calm precision. She taught anatomy, not from books she couldn't safely carry, but from memory. Diagrams drawn in dirt, lines traced in ash, explanations whispered in the safety of night. She explained which injuries discouraged future assaults, which injuries were survivable for the attacker, which mattered under the law, which techniques could be argued as self-defense instead of rebellion. She never encouraged violence. She never instructed anyone to strike first. She gave knowledge. Women decided what to do with it. And soon, plantation owners noticed. Between 1854 and 1856, 9 separate incidents occurred across Oklahoma and Arkansas territories. Cases where enslaved women injured masters or overseers who attempted assault. The injuries were not random, not sloppy, not desperate. They were precise, calculated, deliberate, designed to end reproductive capability, the same signature Sarah's cases had shown. A group of plantation owners formed the Territorial Property Protection Committee, 23 men angry, frightened, and determined to crush this new pattern. They hired a lawyer from Richmond, Cornelius Vance, a specialist in civil insurrection law. He had prosecuted dozens of rebellion cases. He arrived in Oklahoma Territory with one mission: find a charge that would stick to Sarah Granger. He couldn't charge her for the original assaults. She had been acquitted. Double jeopardy protected her. He couldn't charge her for teaching literacy. She was a free woman. But then he found something else. A statute so obscure that most judges had never used it. Conspiracy to commit mayhem. Under English common law, it didn't require direct action. It didn't require proof she participated in any attack, only that she provided knowledge or encouragement leading to injuries. That was enough. The 4th trial began in August 1856. The prosecution called 17 witnesses, masters who had been injured, overseers who had seen Sarah meeting with women, Even one woman who, under pressure, claimed Sarah had instructed her where to cut. Federal marshals patrolled outside the courthouse. Territory newspapers printed daily updates. Plantation owners filled the gallery with folded arms and tight jaws. Judge Greenage, frail, trembling, aware this would be his final great case, presided with weary dignity. Sarah's defense team consisted of 3 young lawyers from the Territorial Bar Association. They volunteered, drawn by the moral weight of the case. They argued, teaching self-defense is not crime. Knowledge is not conspiracy. Wisdom shared is not violence planned. They called medical experts to testify that Sarah's injuries, though severe, were rarely life-threatening. They pointed out that women in similar cases had been acquitted. But Vance was skilled. He twisted everything. Wasn't this premeditation? Wasn't the pattern evidence of coordination? Didn't Sarah's lessons transform spontaneous resistance into organized sabotage? Then he revealed the most dangerous evidence of all. Sarah's archive. 47 letters. 6 journals. Records of assaults, trials, and outcomes. Medical drawings. Legal strategies. Names of 43 women who had defended themselves. 37 acquitted, 4 convicted, 2 executed. Held up in the courtroom for all to see. This was no longer a woman defending herself. This was a movement. A silent one. A written one. A network of knowledge. Vance thundered to the jury. This is organized resistance. This is a campaign designed to undermine society. But Sarah's lawyer, Robert Chenoweth, answered quietly and with devastating force. For 2 hours he spoke, words later reprinted by abolitionists for decades. Gentlemen of the jury, they call it conspiracy. I call it survival. They call it rebellion. I call it self-defense. They call it organized resistance. I call it the natural consequence of a system that refuses to protect the women it claims to own. His voice shook the room. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Fort Gibson held its breath. Federal troops patrolled the streets. Plantation owners muttered about tightening control. Free black residents and sympathetic whites gathered outside the courthouse in silence. Judge Greenage used the time to write a letter to his daughter, a letter found decades later. In it he wrote, "We build a legal system that requires certain people to be things, not humans. And then we express shock when they remind us they're human." On the 3rd day of deliberation, Greenage died, alone, in his chambers, of heart failure. The trial paused for mourning, then resumed under a new judge. When the jury returned, the foreman looked exhausted. Their verdict, not guilty, on all counts. But there was more. The jury added a written statement, unprecedented and explosive. "We cannot criminalize the teaching of self-defense. We recommend the territory establish legal protections for enslaved women against assault." The courtroom sat frozen. They had not just acquitted Sarah Granger. They had condemned the system itself. The courtroom did not erupt. It did not roar or cry out or collapse into chaos. Instead, it went silent, a deep, unnatural silence, the kind that follows a gunshot no one expected. The jury had not only acquitted Sarah Granger, they had spoken directly to the heart of the system itself, declaring openly that the problem was not her actions, but the world that required those actions for a woman to survive. The reaction outside the courthouse was immediate. The Territorial Property Protection Committee called the verdict an abomination, though they issued no formal statement. Plantation owners muttered darkly in hotel lobbies, in barrooms, and on courthouse steps. Newspapers printed outraged editorials, demanding the verdict be overturned. Some called for Sarah to be exiled. Others called for her arrest on vagrancy charges, anything to remove her influence. But something had shifted. A crack had opened in the FOD of authority. A question had been forced into daylight, a question the territory could not easily hide again. And Sarah seemed strangely untouched by the storm brewing around her. She returned to Fort Gibson. She continued sewing. She attended services at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She wrote letters. She maintained her network. And she waited. In the 18 months that followed her fourth acquittal, Sarah prepared for what she knew was coming. She transferred her documents, her archive, to multiple secure locations. Churches, private homes, a Creek Nation council house, where a sympathetic delegate agreed to store a trunk in tribal archives. She created redundancy. If one location was raided, the others would survive. She trained 3 women, 2 formerly enslaved, 1 freeborn, to continue her work. She taught them not only the anatomy of self-defense, but the discipline of documentation. Write clearly. Record dates. Note locations. Verify details before trusting them. Preserve what others will try to erase. She knew her time was short. She sensed the attention tightening around her like a noose. And she was right. In December 1857, 2 federal marshals arrested her on mail fraud charges. Technical. Absurd. Transparent. A pretext. A weapon formed from procedural law rather than criminal accusation. The prosecution claimed she used the postal system to send information dangerous to public safety. The evidence was weak. A handful of confiscated letters. A postmaster pressured into testifying. Hearsay from informants who could not even specify what they had seen. But the charge didn't matter. The goal was simple. Silence her. Remove her. In the network by ending its center. The trial lasted 2 days. Judge William Patterson, younger, rigid, lacking Breenage's weary conscience, declared that nothing related to self-defense, assault, or resistance would be admissible. Only one question mattered. Did Sarah Granger violate postal regulations? The jury, stripped of context and guided by a judge who left no room for nuance, returned a verdict in 40 minutes. Guilty. The sentence: 18 months in federal detention at Fort Leavenworth, followed by permanent exile from Oklahoma Territory. As marshals took her from the courtroom, Sarah turned to the gallery and said, "They can exile one woman. They cannot exile the knowledge I shared." Fort Leavenworth in 1858 was not a prison designed for rehabilitation. It was a military installation turned detention facility. Stone buildings, damp walls, narrow windows set too high for light to enter meaningfully. Sarah was placed in the women's section, a converted storage building holding 17 inmates. 3 long rooms. Straw mattresses alive with insects. Stone walls that sweated in winter and burned in summer. The rules were strict. Silence during work hours. Single file movement. Mandatory attendance at church services. No physical contact. Letters read and censored. Work always work. Women spent their days bent over tubs of boiling water, scrubbing military uniforms until their hands bled through cracked skin. Some inmates were thieves. Some were murderers. Some were political prisoners, sentenced for crimes that weren't crimes at all. Simply inconvenient truths told aloud. Sarah's reputation followed her anyway. Whispers passed from bunk to bunk. New arrivals stared at her with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and reverence. But she offered no stories, no confessions, no bravado. What I did, she told them, I did for reasons that made sense at the time. What you've heard is close enough. She became something unusual in the prison hierarchy, a quiet center of gravity. Not feared, not worshipped, but listened to. Women sought her advice, not on violence, but on survival. How do I endure this place? How do I hold on to myself here? How do I keep from disappearing in a routine? And Sarah answered, count days only if it helps. Hide when it protects you. Speak when it matters. Write everything down. The only power we have, she said, is the power to be remembered accurately. What the authorities did not understand, and never would, was that Sarah had anticipated this outcome. Her work was already independent of her. The archive was already dispersed. The women she trained no longer needed her oversight. She had built something that could live without her. In March 1858, a coded letter reached her through a sympathetic guard's wife. She burned it after reading, but the words stayed with her. The garden you planted continues to grow. Prison life settled into a punishing rhythm. Wake at 5:30. Mush for breakfast. Work from 7 to noon. Bread and thin soup. Work until 6. Lights out at 8. Sundays meant double sermons, morning and evening, from a Methodist chaplain who preached about repentance without ever looking inmates in the eyes. Sarah adapted. Her body remembered hardship. Her mind remembered discipline. Her spirit remembered purpose. But even she had limits. July brought a heat wave that turned the women's section into a stone oven. 3 women died that month. 1 from heat stroke, 2 from dysentery that spread through the cramped rooms. Sarah survived the heat, but not without damage. Her hands blistered. Her breathing grew strained. A persistent cough developed, at first a nuisance, then a warning. By October, she was fevered. By November, she could barely stand during roll call. Dr. Albert Richardson examined her and diagnosed pneumonia, aggravated by damp walls, boiling laundry tubs, and exhaustion. He requested improved rations and infirmary care. The commandant denied the rations, budget constraints, but he allowed the transfer. Sarah was moved to a 6-bed infirmary. 2 women had tuberculosis. 1 lay dying for a wasting disease. Another recovered slowly from a fractured collarbone. Sarah took the bed nearest the window, where the air was cold but at least moving. In the infirmary, her world narrowed. The angle of light across the stone floor. The sound of boots outside at dawn. The rasp of the woman coughing 2 beds away. The draft that flickered her fever. And the slow, steady realization that her body was failing. Yet she remained clear-headed whenever the fever dipped. She spoke softly to other patients. She asked for updates on the women she trained. She asked if any letters had arrived. She did not ask about herself. In moments of lucidity, she wrote. Sometimes resistance means surviving. Sometimes surviving means being remembered. On December 1st, her fever broke briefly. She asked for paper, for ink, for time. Mrs. Hale, the matron, hesitated, then granted the request. Sarah wrote 3 letters that afternoon. Slowly, painfully, steadily. 1 to her friends in Fort Gibson. 1 to the women continuing her archive. 1 to Judge Breenage's daughter, who had become active in abolitionist circles. In the final letter, she wrote, "Your father understood that law without justice is organized violence. Tell your children he once chose conscience over convention." The letters were sealed. Passed to Mrs. Hale. History suggests they were mailed. On the night of December 2nd, Sarah's fever surged. Her breathing grew shallow. Her pulse thinned. Dr. Richardson increased the laudanum. Comfort was all he could offer. Just before dawn, with only 2 women and Mrs. Hale present, Sarah whispered, "The work continues." Then she died. She was 34. She was buried that afternoon in the prison cemetery. An unmarked grave. A wooden stake. 185-8117. The 17th prisoner to die that year. There were no mourners. No eulogy beyond the chaplain's standard, empty prayer. But news travels quietly through the network she built. And when the world learned of Sarah Granger's death, something began that could no longer be stopped. News of Sarah's death reached Oklahoma Territory 2 weeks later. A military courier delivered the notices to Fort Gibson, carrying them in a stack of routine correspondence, supply ledgers, territorial orders, and winter reports. The death announcement appeared in the newspaper as a single, clipped line. Sarah Granger, convicted of mail fraud, deceased at Fort Leavenworth, December 3rd. No services planned. The brevity was intentional. A deliberate attempt to reduce her life, her trials, her network, her legacy, to the smallest possible footprint. A bureaucratic footnote. But word travels differently among those who remember. Among the communities Sarah had influenced, enslaved, formerly enslaved, Free Black Creek, Cherokee, and even a handful of sympathetic white families, her death moved through quieter, deeper channels. Whispered in churchyards, repeated in kitchens, carried from mouth to ear in the back rows of meeting houses. The reactions varied, as complex as the woman herself. Among territorial authorities and plantation owners, the dominant emotion was relief, sharp, private, unspoken relief. Yet beneath that relief lay something else. A thin, lingering unease. Because even they understood that Sarah had changed something permanently, even if they could not admit it aloud. Cornelius Vance, the Richmond lawyer who had built the case against her, wrote in a letter to a colleague, "The Granger problem has resolved itself through natural causes. Perhaps now the territory can return to order, though I fear her influence may prove more enduring than anticipated." He was right to fear. Among the communities Sarah had served, her death did not break them. It galvanized them. The archive she built, scattered across churches, tribal council houses, and private homes, became sacred. Her letters were no longer simply letters, they were instructions, precedents, history, and warning. Elizabeth, one of the 3 women Sarah had personally trained, wrote in her journal 3 days after hearing the news. She taught us that knowledge is the only power that survives a grave. They silenced her voice, but they cannot silence what she documented. It must continue. It will continue. And so the archive did what Sarah designed it to do. It lived. It multiplied. It spread. Within 18 months of her death, the network she started expanded beyond anything she could have orchestrated alone. Women from Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee began sending letters. Some were detailed. Some were brief. Some were written in trembling hands by women who had never written a letter before. All were preserved. This expansion terrified authorities. In April 1859, officials in Arkansas intercepted a packet of letters traveling between Fort Smith and a church in Little Rock. The letters contained accounts of assaults, descriptions of resistance, legal outcomes, summaries of trials, notes on which judges could be trusted and which could not, a map of survival. 5 women were arrested and charged with conspiracy and seditious correspondence. The trial drew enormous attention. Prosecutors tried to tie every piece of evidence back to Sarah, even though she was dead. But their effort backfired, because the defense attorneys, in order to challenge the accusations, entered the confiscated letters into the official court record. Suddenly, the details Sarah had documented, the patterns she had identified, became public. Newspapers printed them, not because they wanted to spread her message, but because they wanted to sensationalize the trial. But the effect was the same. People read the letters. People talked. People wondered. The 5 women were convicted, but lightly. 6 months in county jail. No federal transfer. Time served counted. At sentencing, the judge said something no one expected. The circumstances that give rise to these acts deserve examination by lawmakers. Punishment is insufficient if the conditions remain unchanged. A small shift, a crack in the wall, another echo of Sarah's influence. Meanwhile, the material Sarah had once guarded so carefully found new protectors. Some were preserved in church basements in Fort Gibson and Tahlequah, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in crates of hymnals. Others went to newly formed African American historical societies in northern cities. Still others remained in tribal archives, where Creek Nation historians recognized their value almost immediately. One particularly remarkable set of documents, a series of letters and trial summaries, survived because of a Presbyterian minister named Harold Thompson. Thompson had served in Fort Gibson during the 1850s. He had been, by his own later admission, troubled but silent about slavery. After the Civil War, while sorting old church records, he discovered a hidden compartment beneath the pulpit. Inside, a bundle of Sarah's correspondence, wrapped in faded cloth. He could have destroyed them. He could have ignored them. He could have pretended he never saw them. Instead, he read them, cataloged them, annotated them, and in 1877, donated them to a seminary library in Ohio. In his accompanying letter, he wrote, "These documents do not flatter my generation. They reveal what we prefer not to see. I preserve them because future generations deserve the truth, not the comforting illusions we told ourselves." The legal legacy of Sarah's trials proved just as complicated as her historical one. Her acquittals did not form official precedent. Judges could argue her cases were too specific, too unusual. And yet between 1859 and 1865, at least 11 trials involving enslaved people charged with assaulting their masters contained references, indirect, subtle references to territorial understandings regarding self-defense under duress. Never naming her, but echoing her. Defense attorneys learned how to invoke the logic of her acquittals. Was the assault in response to imminent threat? Was the force proportional? Was the victim attempting to prevent a greater harm? Judges became hesitant to issue death sentences in cases resembling hers. Juries began to ask questions they had never asked before. Sarah's name rarely appeared, but her influence threaded through the system like a silent current. Her legacy extended beyond the courtroom. The women she trained, and the women they trained, operated quietly through the chaos of the Civil War. In 1863, when Union troops occupied Oklahoma Territory, officers encountered something unexpected. Communities that were organized, communities that preserved written records, communities that knew legal procedures better than some officers did. Major Benjamin Harris wrote in his official report, "The Negro population here displays an unexpected level of preparation. They maintain extensive documentation of their circumstances and understand their rights with unusual clarity." He did not know he was witnessing the afterlife of Sarah's archive. But those communities knew. They remembered. The three men Sarah injured lived out their lives in ways history could not romanticize. James Wickham left Oklahoma in 1860, moving to New Orleans. He never remarried, never fathered children, died of yellow fever in 1873, alone in a boarding house. In his personal effects, administrators found one curious item: a newspaper clipping about Sarah's trials, folded neatly inside his wallet. Why he kept it remains unknown. Marcus Sheffield remained in Oklahoma, served in the territorial legislature, gave speeches about reconciling the past with the future, never mentioned Sarah's name. But in 1869 he said, "We built a system that demanded people endure the unbearable. And then we expressed shock when they refused." People knew who he was talking about. Elias Drummond changed the most. The man who freed Sarah became a Reconstruction advocate, supported educational institutions and legal aid societies for Black residents. When confronted during a town meeting about his past with Sarah, he said, "I believed ownership justified behavior. I was corrected decisively. That correction changed me." History leaves the sincerity of his words to interpretation. By the 1920s, the prison cemetery at Fort Leavenworth was reorganized. The graves of federal prisoners, including Sarah's, were moved to an unmarked mass grave along the eastern boundary. A stone marker, erected in 1934, reads, "Here rest those whose lives ended in federal custody. May their stories not be forgotten." A universal epitaph. A generic consolation, a quiet irony, because Sarah's work existed precisely to prevent stories like hers from disappearing into that kind of silence. The legacy she left behind, scattered, partial, resilient, would go on to shape communities, historians, activists, and legal thinkers for generations. And it began with one truth she understood more clearly than anyone around her. Resistance means nothing unless someone writes it down. By the late 1800s, Sarah Granger's name had drifted into the uncertain space between memory and rumor. Too controversial to celebrate, too significant to erase. Mentioned quietly in certain communities and absent from others by deliberate choice. Her story might have vanished entirely, if not for a researcher named Margaret Hutchinson. In 1891, Hutchinson arrived in Tahlequah to collect historical accounts for a national publication. She interviewed elderly residents who remembered the pre-Civil War years, the chaos, the contradictions, the collisions of cultures in Indian Territory. And again, she heard a name: Sarah Granger, a woman whose trials had shaken the territory, a woman whose knowledge had frightened plantation owners, a woman whose archive, some said, still existed somewhere, scattered, hidden, waiting. At first, Hutchinson dismissed the stories. They sounded too dramatic, too embellished, too aligned with abolitionist legend. But then someone directed her to a Presbyterian church in Tahlequah. Someone told her to ask about the trunk. The church elders had no idea what she meant. But an elderly congregant, remembering a secret passed down through 2 generations, unlocked a storage room beneath the old pulpit. Inside was a wooden trunk wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the trunk were letters, journals, and copied documents. Yellowed, fragile, but unmistakably real. Sarah's archive, the same one her network had protected for decades after her death. Hutchinson spent 6 months authenticating everything. Every date, every name, every trial, every injury, every recorded whisper of resistance. She cross-referenced them with court records, newspaper archives, military reports from Fort Gibson and Fort Leavenworth. And the truth stood firm. Sarah Granger's documentation was meticulous, accurate, far ahead of its time. Hutchinson published her findings in 1893 under the title, A Peculiar Case of Resistance: The Life and Legal Trials of Sarah Granger. The article caused a quiet stir in academic circles. Not explosive, but steady. Not sensational, but undeniable. Mainstream historians ignored it. They preferred narratives of benevolent masters and passive enslaved workers. But African American communities, women's rights advocates, and early legal reformers embraced it. Sarah's name began reappearing in speeches, in newsletters, in pamphlets, in whispered stories told in kitchens and church basements. But she remained a figure too complex for easy heroism. A woman who resisted through violence. A woman who documented what others wanted buried. A woman who forced moral questions the law wasn't built to answer. As the decades passed, the archive dispersed again. Some pieces lost to fires, others hidden during dangerous political times, still others passed quietly down through families. But certain practices survived. Documentation, record-keeping, mutual protection, women teaching other women. The understanding that knowledge itself was resistance. When Oklahoma achieved statehood in 1907, communities shaped by Sarah's methods were still there. Organized, prepared, self-taught, quietly passing forward the habits of survival she had planted. Most of the women mentioned in her letters died without written history. Their stories existed only through Sarah's careful notes. Names preserved where the world would have forgotten them entirely. Some young, some old, some enslaved, some free, all fighting in their own ways. Their individual lives vanished in a time, but the pattern Sarah identified endured. A pattern of refusal, a pattern of self-defense, a pattern of saying no in a world where that word could cost a woman her life. The men whose lives she changed, Wickham, Sheffield, and Drummond, carried their own silence. Wickham fled west to escape shame. Sheffield turned himself into a politician who spoke of the burdens of the past. Drummond tried, perhaps genuinely, to atone, but none ever spoke Sarah's name publicly. Some silences exist because there are no words. Other silences exist because the truth is unbearable. By the 1920s, the old prison cemetery at Fort Leavenworth was reorganized. Sarah's grave, once marked only by 185-8117, vanished into a mass relocation. A stone marker placed by a women's historical society read, "Here rest those whose lives ended in federal custody. May their stories not be forgotten." The inscription was gentle, universal, safe, precisely the kind of memorial Sarah had resisted all her life. She refused to be a nameless figure in the margins. She fought, brutally, clearly, intelligently, to carve a record for women whose histories were not meant to survive. And she succeeded. Her story resurfaced again in the early 20th century as historians revisited overlooked narratives of resistance. The letters she wrote, the journals she kept, the testimonies she sparked, they became foundational to understanding the hidden architectures of survival among enslaved women in the South and Indian Territory. Her methods were studied in new ways, as early legal strategy, as organized documentation under oppression, as proto-civil rights activism, as a blueprint for resisting systems built on ownership and silence. And yet, Sarah remained hard to categorize. She wasn't a reformer. She wasn't a preacher. She wasn't a political activist. She was something rarer, a historian of resistance, a chronicler of truth, a witness who refused to let the world forget the women it tried to erase. The questions her life raised did not end with her trials. What is self-defense in a world that denies your humanity? What is justice in a system built on ownership? What is violence when the alternative is violation? What is resistance when silence is expected? What is freedom when the law refuses to see you? Sarah Granger's life offered no simple answers, but she forced the questions into the open. And once spoken, such questions cannot be unsaid. Her legacy persisted in the hands of women who never knew her face, in courtrooms where lawyers used arguments created by her trials, in archives where historians found fragments of her handwriting, in communities where mothers taught daughters how to survive a world that still demanded silence. In the end, Sarah Granger died in an unmarked grave at 34. Her body lost, her name nearly erased, her story nearly buried. But the work she built, the knowledge she preserved, outlived her. It lived in letters. It lived in memory. It lived in the painful honesty she wrote into every page. It lived in the courage of women who would never be documented, never be remembered by name, but who acted because she had shown them how to understand their own lives. History remembers generals and presidents easily. It remembers battles and treaties, monuments and speeches. But history also depends on people like Sarah, people who write down what the world would rather ignore, people whose truth burns long after their bodies are gone, people who remind future generations that silence is a choice and not the only one. And so, her work continues, in every account of resistance, in every woman who learns her own worth, in every archive built by hands once denied the right to write. Sarah Granger's life ended in 1858, but the knowledge she created did not end with her. And because of that, because she insisted on documenting reality the world wanted hidden, the system that tried to silence her failed. Her story survived. Her questions survived. Her truth survived.